It wasn't long before Snowcrystal and her friends met up with Nightshade and the others in the large cavern. The Golbat knew the entire cave by heart, and quickly showed them the shortest way to the place where their friends rested. The going had still been somewhat slow, but this time, it hadn't been just Stormblade who was slowing the group down. Thunder had been having difficulty keeping up as well, though she had tried to disguise the fact by acting as if she had wanted the others to walk ahead of her with the strangers instead of near her. Despite the journey being slow, everyone made it without any danger. Now the group huddled in the cavern, listening to a few Zubat who had explored the cave while looking for Snowcrystal's group talking to Shade. We went by a few of the exits. There are strange Pokemon everywhere, just waiting. One of them shot a flamethrower at us. He's right. They all seem to be expecting something. We know just what they're waiting for, Redclaw told them, his gaze dark and serious. They want Blazefang's forbidden attack. Well, Cyclone wants it for one of his fire-type cronies. In the short time the group had talked with Shade, Redclaw had explained everything they knew about Cyclone and his intention, while Blazefang huddled sullenly in a corner of the cavern, his back pressed against the smooth rock as he listened to the conversation with dread. I think your only sure way out, the Weavile leader began, is through the exit I told you about before. You can only get there by swimming through a vast underground lake, and the exit is in the middle of a large canyon, full of tall rocks and foliage, and very difficult to climb down from the top. Flying Pokemon will find it difficult to track you with all the cover the area provides, though you will have to be careful. Underwater? Rosie cried, her eyes widening. Are you crazy? There are water Pokemon here that would be willing to help you if I asked them to, Shade replied. But, like I mentioned to some of you earlier, it may be difficult to hold your breath for the length of time it takes a water Pokemon to swim through that tunnel. But no, it certainly won't kill you, he added before Rosie could protest again. It would be best to leave soon, he added, in case the army finds out from any local Pokemon that there is a hidden exit they haven't checked. Almost involuntarily, Snowcrystal glanced sideways at Stormblade. The Scyther was still lying motionless, sprawled across the floor the same way he had since they had reached the cavern. The raw burns that covered his body looked sickly in the pale light. He gave no sign or any indication that he was listening to anyone. Well, I think it's about time we got out of here, Nightshade told Shade, startling Snowcrystal out of her thoughts. From the sound of it, there's plenty of food and water in this canyon, so I don't see any reason for us to wait around here. Spark brightened up at the mention of food, and Wildflame looked eager to keep moving. However, Blazefang and Rosie both looked worried. Redclaw went to help Stormblade, and the rest of the group gathered together. Follow me, Shade told them, and began leading the way ahead. We barely got a chance to rest, Rosie mumbled as she limped after the others, keeping close to Snowcrystal and Wildflame. During the short journey, Snowcrystal couldn't help feeling worried as they walked through strange passages and tunnels that twisted in every direction. She had no sense of where they were going or where they had come from anymore, but she reminded herself that Shade knew what he was doing. Stormblade had decided to walk by himself, despite the fact that he was obviously weakening. Thunder had kept to the front of the group during the first part of the walk, but after another dizzy spell, she had been forced to walk at a slower pace, though she was still ahead of Stormblade. Snowcrystal's fur prickled uneasily as they once again reached the edge of a vast underground lake. She noticed Thunder growl and back away warily. Once near the water, Stormblade lay down and closed his eyes, too exhausted to move. So, do we just have to wait? Snowcrystal asked Shade. The Weavile was about to answer when Rosie suddenly shouted, "What is he doing here?" Snowcrystal turned to see Blazefang stop in his tracks. A look of fear plastered across the Houndour's face. Snowcrystal had suspected that he would follow them, and it didn't surprise her to see him there. "Go find your own way out," Rosie yelled to the Houndour. "We're not helping you." "Actually, Rosie," Nightshade interrupted, I think it would be wise to help him. Rosie rounded on the Heracross. Why? She demanded. Nightshade turned toward her, his yellow eyes serious. Do you want Cyclone to get his claws on Shadowflare? At this response, Rosie was silent. How are we going to ride some water Pokemon under the water? Snowcrystal asked Shade, who had been briefly distracted by Rosie's outburst. Either Mystic or River can carry you. I know them well, and I'm sure they'd be willing to help. It won't be an easy journey, though, Shade warned, but it will get you out safe. But, Shade, Wildflame spoke suddenly, walking toward him. I've been thinking. There's no way Stormblade could make it through that. He barely has enough strength as it is, and being carried will probably be too painful because of his injuries. A silence hung over the group, and Snowcrystal was sure that if Stormblade were carried, it would only make his injuries worse. There's not much we can do about that, she told the others regretfully. He'll have to do it. She was surprised when Stormblade suddenly spoke up. No, I won't, he told her, and added with bitter regret. I'm not strong enough. I wouldn't make it. If one of the cave Pokemon can guide me to another exit, and then to the rest of you, I could meet up with you later. But what about the army? Rosie asked. They won't bother me, Stormblade told her. I can't fight for them, so they won't want anything from me. And if a Zubat guides me, he or she could easily hide from them. Look, he added, seeing their doubtful faces. I'm not some helpless hatchling. I'm strong enough to do this. You can barely walk, Snowcrystal pointed out, realizing too late that it was probably the wrong thing to say. I can travel at my own pace, Stormblade said simply. Believe me, I don't want to weaken myself more than I already am. All right, Snowcrystal told him. Just be careful. I'm sure whoever wants to guide you will help you if you need it. She wasn't sure what the Pokemon guiding Stormblade would be able to do to help him, but she pushed that thought to the back of her mind. Maybe Stormblade was stronger than he seemed. Snowcrystal jumped suddenly when a large Pokemon's long neck and head burst out of the water, confronting Shade with curiosity. It was a graceful Pokemon, a large serpentine creature covered in pearly scales, ranging in color from creamy white to bright red and blue. Shade? The Milotic asked, regarding the travelers with curiosity. Who are these Pokemon? They're travelers, Mystic, Shade explained. They need to get out of the cave in secret as quickly as possible. I don't have much time to explain now, but I will certainly explain later. I need you to take these Pokemon one by one through the underwater exit, and fast. Snowcrystal noticed the Milotic's eyes drifting toward Thunder, and the large water-type Pokemon sneered slightly, but the Scyther didn't seem to notice. The Milotic turned to the group and sighed. Very well, she told them, but don't think you're going for a pleasant swim. All I ask is that you don't pass out. At that statement, Rosie and Wildflame exchanged nervous glances. You'll be fine, Stormblade told them gently. I'll meet up with you and the others later. Thanks, Stormblade, Rosie told him, smiling, though she still looked rather scared. So, who's going first? Shade asked, and after a moment where no one said anything, Redclaw volunteered. Snowcrystal watched with fascination as Mystic bent down and lifted the Arcanine by the scruff of his neck, making him look like a small puppy hanging from its mother's jaws. It looked almost comical. Mystic turned and carried the Arcanine over the water, swimming to where the lake met the opposite wall of the cave. Then, while still holding Redclaw in her mouth, the colossal Milotic dived under, creating a large splash that soon settled, leaving the water crystal clear and smooth again. For what seemed like ages, but really couldn't have been more than a few minutes, the group waited in silence. Snowcrystal kept leaning her head against Stormblade's leg, watching the water worriedly. Then, all at once, Mystic's graceful head reared out of the water, and she turned to face the rest of the group. Snowcrystal once again felt very small at the sight of the huge Milotic towering over all of them. He made it safe, she informed the others. He's recovering now. So who is going to go next? Wanting to seem brave in front of the others, Spark volunteered. Like Redclaw, he was picked up and carried under the water. This time, Snowcrystal was less worried, and when Mystic later surfaced and told them that Spark had made it safely as well, Wildflame, wanting to get it over with, went next. This time, Mystic seemed to take longer, and when she returned, she explained that Wildflame had breathed in some water during the journey, but would soon be all right. Rosie refused to go next, and Nightshade, who had volunteered to go last, suggested that Thunder take the next turn. At first, Thunder had refused, not liking the thought of any other Pokemon touching her. But the others managed to convince her to let Mystic carry her by the wings, under the promise that she would be allowed to attack the Milotic if she purposely tried to drown her. Obviously, Mystic had no such intention, but the promise seemed to make Thunder more willing to be carried under the water. Afterward, Blazefang volunteered, and then Rosie, although with hesitation. Snowcrystal waited for Mystic to return after taking Rosie through the tunnel, knowing that her turn was next. "Are you scared?" Stormblade asked her, turning to look down at her. "A little," Snowcrystal admitted, still staring at the water. "It'll be all right," Stormblade replied, following her gaze. "The others seem to have made it through all right. You'll be just fine." I hope so," Snowcrystal replied shakily, and looked back up at him. "Are you sure you'll be all right traveling alone? I mean, I'm sure Mystic could—" "There's no way she'd be able to carry me with these injuries," Stormblade replied, almost bitterly. "And I won't be alone. One of the cave Pokemon will be willing to guide me, so don't worry. I might take a while meeting up with you and the others, but I'll be just fine. I promise." "Are you sure?" Snowcrystal asked him, uncertain. "Positive." "Okay," Snowcrystal said with a sigh, but quickly drove any doubts away from her mind. She was probably worrying too much. A large splash caused her to look up, and Mystic looked at her. Slowly, the Growlithe stood up and walked over to the huge Milotic. Dozens of different thoughts running through her head at the same time. She had no idea what this experience was going to be like. "Good luck," Stormblade called to her, trying to smile. Snowcrystal turned and smiled back at him, as Mystic leaned down toward her. "Remember," the Milotic said, "just before we reach the cave wall over there, take a deep breath." Snowcrystal felt teeth meet in her scruff, and her body was lifted off the ground. Mystic lifted her head high above the water, and Snowcrystal was fascinated with how the vast cavern and its glimmering crystals looked like from above. Mystic slowly neared the wall, and once they were close, Snowcrystal took a deep breath, and then the Milotic plunged into the icy water. Despite the fact that she was too used to cold to be bothered by it, the speed at which the Milotic had dived and was carrying her through the black water came as a huge shock, and she had to fight the urge to instinctively struggle. Feeling like she would need a breath of air soon if she moved too much, Snowcrystal forced her body to relax and closed her eyes, trying to remain calm and to not use up any of her energy. That would only make her run out of air faster. As the two of them seemed to glide through the water, Snowcrystal suddenly felt the urge to open her eyes. She did so, realizing with great surprise that she could see. While she had expected the underwater world to be completely dark, somewhere, far deep down in the water's depths, were large and small specks of glowing light. They covered the entire floor of the tunnel, far below and up ahead. There were even more. She realized that these must be more glowing crystals. Further on, these crystals covered the entire floor of the large underwater tunnel Mystic was swimming through, which was narrow but very deep, like some sort of massive abyss. Starting to feel dizzy, Snowcrystal focused her gaze on the way ahead. Still too fascinated by the glowing crystals far down below to close her eyes, that was when she noticed it. Up ahead, some of the lights seemed to be flickering out in large groups. Yet a moment later, those crystals would be bright again, and others would go dark. It took her a moment to realize that it wasn't the crystal's light going out. It was something huge swimming above them like a dark shadow. The growlithe's eyes widened, and just when she began to wonder if it was another Milotic, Mystic swerved violently to the right, almost causing Snowcrystal to gasp in shock. Mystic turned again, and then swam in a straight direction, but was clearly increasing speed, when before that hadn't seemed possible. Snowcrystal fearfully wondered what was wrong. She had lost sight of the dark thing, and a moment later, several things happened at once. Snowcrystal heard a horrible sound, like some sort of deranged roar distorted by the water, and Mystic's whole body violently shuddered as if something had crashed into her, and at the same instant, the Milotic let go of Snowcrystal. Though she made no sound, the weakening growlithe was screaming in her mind. Without thinking, she lashed out with all four paws, trying to swim back to Mystic. She quickly realized she was hopelessly wasting energy, growing weaker, and she held still, hoping that the Milotic would be able to help her. She looked up, and her eyes met one of the eeriest sights she had ever seen. Mystic was entangled with a massive Gyarados, which was trying to sink its teeth into her side. She was distracted from the sight of the two thrashing serpents when she became aware that she was sinking, slowly but surely, toward the crystals below. There was a stabbing pain in her chest, steadily growing worse. She could not hold her breath much longer. She couldn't tell where Mystic or the Gyarados were anymore. She couldn't hear them, but they sounded far away. Even the light of the crystals had dimmed. Everything around her was fading. The pain was growing worse. And then she could stand it no more, and inhaled. Water instantly filled her mouth and throat, choking her and making her thrash about in shock as icy needles of pain shot through her chest and head. In a panic, she thrashed her paws, not knowing if the direction she was swimming was up or down. Terror filled her mind. She was a fire type, and the prospect of drowning suddenly seemed all the more frightening. She felt her body growing weaker, feeling as if the water was extinguishing her very life. The pain intensified for a few more agonizing moments. Then it started to dull, and at the same time, so did everything around her. The sounds, the sights, the fear. Then it all went black. Mystic had not expected this Gyarados to be here. He was a cave dweller, a strange Gyarados who wanted nothing to do with the outside, and in turn sought to protect the cave from intruders. Though he did not usually come to this part of the cave, she did not think he could have mistaken her for an intruder. She wondered if he'd caught the scent of all the strange Pokemon she had been carrying through the tunnel and misunderstood her intentions, thinking that she was using the tunnel to bring Pokemon to and from the cave. Luckily, in a matter of seconds, Mystic had managed to twist free of the large Gyarados, sending him flying backwards into the wall with a twister attack. Rushing forward, she slammed her tail into the side of his head, momentarily stunning him. "Leave!" she cried, her harmonious voice sounding clearly even through the water. "I am helping them exit the cave!" Without waiting for a response, she turned and swam in wide circles, going deeper into the dark water, searching for the white growlithe who had been swallowed up by the cold blackness. Yet, even with the light of the crystals from below, the water was too dark for her to see the small Pokemon. It barely registered to her that the Gyarados was no longer trying to attack. She was too frantic in her search. Quickly, she swam in wider and wider circles, looking left and right for any sign of the small Pokemon. Then she saw a sign. Somewhere down below, just a tiny pinprick of light, was a small, glowing red dot. The Growlithe's crystal. Mystic rushed forward in a headlong dive toward the light. Feeling the water grow colder the deeper she submerged. Her eyes were focused on the small dot of light, fearing she would lose sight of it if she looked away. Time seemed to stand still as the distance between herself and the light shrank ever so slowly. Then she could see the Growlithe. Swimming faster, she caught up to the quickly sinking Pokemon. Gripping Snowcrystal's scruff again, the Milotic swam upwards, as fast as she was able to, hoping the tiny bundle she held in her mouth was still alive. Then the water began turning from black to deep blue. There was light ahead. The calm river which flowed out from the cave was dappled with sunlight further ahead. Mystic swam faster, and the surface seemed to rush to meet her. Mystic felt both joy and relief as her head broke through the surface and into open air. All around her, lush vegetation and the wide, calm river gave her a feeling of relief. But she knew there couldn't be relief quite yet. Racing over to the bank, the Milotic quickly set the small puppy Pokemon onto the sand. Snowcrystal lay unmoving. "Snowcrystal!" Wildflame shouted from somewhere nearby, racing over to her. The Houndoom still looked shaky and weak, but quite healthy compared to the Growlithe lying on the shore. Some of the group got up and approached her, while others hung back, watching. Redclaw gently pressed his muzzle to Snowcrystal's side. The Growlithe made no movement at first, but then stirred weakly, her eyes flickering open a second before closing again. Redclaw nudged her once more, seeing the small Growlithe begin to move again. "I'm going to go back for your last member," Mystic told them, seeing that Snowcrystal had started to recover and was beginning to cough up some of the water. She watched as Wildflame and Redclaw sat next to her, helping her in any way they could. "After that, I must leave. I don't like swimming outside of the cave in plain sight. And I still have to look after River." With that, she turned and dove back into the water, vanishing into the dark hole deep below the river's surface, which led into the cave. Snowcrystal felt her senses slowly returning to her, and she paused to look around, her eyes widening in shock when she saw the way they had come from. A massive wall of stone reared up to great heights where the river began, flanked on either side by the massive cliffs that formed both walls of the canyon. Below the wall of stone, somewhere beneath the water, was the entrance to the cave. She turned to look at the canyon that stretched far into the distance, and up ahead she could see a small area where the sides of the cliffs were more like gently sloping hills, which led to a more flat area covered in trees and rocks halfway up the side of the canyon wall. "There," she whispered, lifting her head weakly. "That seems like the easiest way to travel along these cliffs." She tried to get up and stumbled, and Redclaw stopped her fall with his foreleg. "You need to rest for now," the Arcanine told her. "We will leave once Nightshade arrives and you have recovered." "I'm fine," Snowcrystal whispered uncertainly, pulling away from him. However, a few seconds later, she felt a wave of dizziness and lay back down. Though she felt terribly weak, she considered herself lucky that Mystic had found a way to rescue her quickly and bring her to the surface. After a short time, the Milotic was back with Nightshade, who seemed to have fared far better than most of the others during the journey. Mystic informed them that nothing had gone wrong, and just when Snowcrystal was about to ask about the Gyarados, she decided against it. Mystic would probably be able to reason with him later, considering that she had been a good enough fighter to keep him at bay long enough to rescue her, and mentioning the Gyarados might cause the others unnecessary worry. "Well, now that you're here, you better get going," Mystic warned. "That army won't know there's an exit over here, so flying Pokemon might not be headed this way. But still, be careful." "We will," Wildflame told her, and the Milotic, looking uneasy about being in the open, vanished back underwater. "We're going to rest here for a while before we move on," Redclaw told Nightshade. "Some of us need to." No one argued with the suggestion, and for a while the Pokemon lay down in peace, though Redclaw kept glancing skyward quite often. Blazefang, who was lying away from the main group beneath the shelter of a few trees, shared the Arcanine's worry, though he did nothing to show it. Once everyone had recovered enough, they set out at a slow pace up the easy-to-climb slope, heading to the flat ridge of stone and earth along the cliffs that Snowcrystal had pointed out. Blazefang trailed behind the group, at a loss for what else to do. Nightshade and Redclaw found themselves acting as the leaders for the group, and once under the shelter of the trees along the wide ridge halfway up the cliffs, they allowed the group to stop and rest, as Stormblade still needed to catch up. "Do you think Stormblade will make it here okay?" Snowcrystal asked Redclaw while everyone was either resting or hunting. "We may have to wait a while, but we'll travel slow and take plenty of breaks," Redclaw replied. "I don't want to stay in one place too long, but I do know it'll be hard for Stormblade to catch up," he sighed. "I really don't know if he should have offered to make that journey alone." "At least he won't be completely alone," Snowcrystal replied, "and he knows that he needs to rest often. He told me he'd be fine. I'm just a little worried." "Well, Cyclone's army won't see any use for a badly injured Pokemon," Redclaw replied. "As for us, well, we're going to have to be careful for a while, especially since there could be flying Pokemon around." Snowcrystal stood up and walked over to the edge of the steep cliff leading down to the river. "I know, but this place looks so peaceful, and it seems like there will be plenty of food. It really feels safe here. Compared to what we've been through, it probably is safe," Redclaw replied, walking over to her. "We'll be able to travel slower, sleep longer, and rest more often. But we still have to be careful and keep looking to the skies." Snowcrystal paused to glance upward, but all she saw were a few Pidgey fluttering by to land beside a nest in a tree further down below. Still, the thought that a Pokemon from Cyclone's army could soar overhead and recognize Blazefang made her afraid. If they saw any suspicious Pokemon, Blazefang would have to hide as quickly as he could, for the sake of everyone. She nodded nervously, repeating Redclaw's words in a whisper to herself. "Keep looking to the skies." Stormblade had been shown the way to the nearest cave exit by a Crobat who had volunteered to lead him after Shade had explained the situation to a group of cave Pokemon. By now, the Scyther was so severely weakened by pain and hunger that it was sheer willpower alone that kept him going. The Crobat, Echo Song, watched him with concern as he stumbled yet again, leaning heavily on the wall of the cave to keep himself from falling. "I think you should rest again," she advised him. "No," Stormblade replied shakily. "I want to find the others. Let's keep going." Echo Song sighed. "All right. It's not far now." Silently, the two Pokemon traveled through a narrow tunnel which led upwards, until finally, light shone up ahead. "Careful, Stormblade," Echo Song warned him. "Those strange Pokemon are probably lurking around out there. I'll fly out quickly, and you just make it past those Pokemon. Like you said, they'll probably just ignore you, and I'll meet up with you once you're out of their sight. All right?" "All right," Stormblade replied, nodding shakily. Echo Song suddenly zoomed toward the cave opening, vanishing into the brightness. Stormblade waited a few moments before starting to follow her, slowly but surely nearing the light. When he stumbled out into the brightness, the scent of strange Pokemon was everywhere, but that didn't surprise him. However, the moment he had stepped out of the cave, he was momentarily blinded by the strong sunlight. Closing his eyes in surprise, he started to hobble forward. He only got a few paces before something roughly grabbed him around the neck. Digging its claws into the burn marks left by the metal collar Team Rocket had put around his neck back at the old building. "Well, who's this?" a voice sneered. "Is he a friend of yours?" By this time, Stormblade's eyes had adjusted to the light long enough to see that the Pokemon holding him was a very large Tyranitar. Put him down," muttered another Pokemon, an Ursaring. "He'll be carry-on in a few days." "Fine," the Tyranitar muttered grudgingly, throwing the Scyther roughly to the ground. Stormblade lifted his head and slowly got to his feet. There were 3 Pokemon there, the Tyranitar, an Ursaring, and a Scyther. The same Scyther he had seen before in the cave. His eyes widened in shock as he noticed that the Scyther was holding Echo Song in her jaws. The Crobat was dead, and there was a deep slash across her body. The Ursaring followed Stormblade's gaze and looked at the other Scyther. That one looked healthy, though, he remarked. So? She muttered, dropping the crowbat to the ground. There's barely enough food to go around as it is. Cyclone will never know. Stormblade froze. He recognized her voice, and now that his eyes had completely adjusted to the light and he could see her clearly, he realized it wasn't just her voice he recognized. He knew this Scyther. What are you staring at? The Scyther spat, glaring at Stormblade. It became obvious to him that she didn't recognize him, even though he remembered that she had heard someone call him by his name in the cave. Silverbreeze? Stormblade asked slowly. What are you doing? Away from the... Before he could register what had happened, the other Scyther had slammed the dull side of her blade so hard into the side of his head that it knocked him over. None of your business, she spat. And how do you know my name? Who are you? Her eyes narrowed for a moment, and she seemed to recall something. Wait. Back in the cave, one of those other Pokemon called you Stormblade. Is that your real name? Confused, Stormblade wondered why she would ask something like that. Surely she would know that Stormblade was his real name. He had to remind himself that with his injuries, he was completely unrecognizable. He decided not to answer. However, after Silverbreeze took a closer look at him, she confirmed the answer for herself. Laughing, she stepped back to the others. So this is what's become of you? She cried. You're certainly not so high and mighty now. Silverbreeze, the Tyranitar began. What other Pokemon did you see in the cave? Was this Scyther with the Houndour? Silverbreeze stopped, turning back to Stormblade. I couldn't see the Houndour in the cave, she began, smiling a little. But you're right. They all went in as a big group. He was one of them. The Tyranitar walked up to the cringing Stormblade and lifted him roughly by one of his wings. Well then, you can tell us where the Houndour is, can't you? Stormblade hesitated. He didn't know the exact location of Blazefang, but even if he had known, giving away the Houndour's location would also be putting his friends in danger. I don't know, he growled. Uh-huh. Sure you don't, the Tyranitar growled. You were with them. Someone was leading you out of the cave. So obviously, your friends have the means to find their way out. But we haven't found them. Where are they? Where are they planning to escape? He bellowed loudly, shaking the Scyther roughly. When Stormblade didn't answer, the Ursaring sighed. This isn't working, he muttered. Bring him to Cyclone. He'll deal with them. And Cyclone will probably be pleased with us too. And you know what that means? A reward. He's right, Silverbreeze agreed. Solus has a way of making Pokemon talk. You stay here, she told the Ursaring. Guard the cave entrance. We'll tell Cyclone you helped too. Now, let's go. She glanced at the Tyranitar, who had grabbed Stormblade's arm above the blade. He began to drag him over to her as she led the way back to the army's main camp.